Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for a conversation and presentation with Joe Pulichino on 5 ways learning theory transforms L&D practice. You're welcome to submit questions or comments into the chat at any time. And if you're so inclined, please let us know where you're joining us from today. That's always fun to see. A recording of this webcast, which will be about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, should be available in the next 2 or 3 days on the Clarity Consultants website and also on Clarity's YouTube channel. With that, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm your host, Brenda McNabb, VP of Service and Development with Clarity Consultants. And I've had the pleasure and privilege over the past 20 years of serving senior L&D leaders in providing top consulting talent. Some of that talent might even be visiting and watching us here today. And this is for anything from project-based work to large-scale managed services programs. And with that, I'd like to introduce our guest today, Joe Pulichino. Joe, how are you doing?
Great, Brenda. Hi, how are you? Hello,
I'm
everyone.
doing really good. Thank you. I just wanted to mention that our producer, Ian Romero, is in Idaho and experiencing some thunderstorms. We hope that that won't impact anything, but if it does, we will adjust, and that might just take a moment, but hopefully it won't. So I'd love to hear something, and I'm sure the audience would love to hear something, Joe, about your background in learning and development and other areas and what you've been focusing on recently.
Okay, great. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for hosting me here. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm really excited to talk about this topic today. Well, I've been in the learning and development racket for many years, a long time. In fact, I'm starting to measure it in decades now. And in a lot of different roles, instructional design and teaching and facilitating and program management in all kinds of industries and company sizes, startups, global companies. And I'd like to say I've seen it all, but with the advent of AI recently, I clearly know that I haven't seen it all. So fasten your seatbelts on that one. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about my career from the standpoint of this topic here, because I can divide my career into two parts, before learning theory and after learning theory. So for quite a long time, actually, I didn't know anything about learning theory, although I was in the training or learning and development space. I was teaching classes at the university. I was then managing different programs at technology companies and building computer-based training, et cetera. And I didn't really have any theoretical background to support any decisions I made about how I was developing or managing things. And then about halfway, or a little bit more than halfway through the decades that have led me here, I went back to school at Pepperdine University to pursue a doctorate in education technology. And the curriculum at that program was 1/3 technology, 1/3 leadership, and 1/3 learning theory. And this is where I first started to learn more about the scientifically proven, research-based theories of how people actually learn. And when I thought about, as I was learning these things, I thought back about how the decisions I'd made and the programs I'd been involved in. And I started to see that there was a real correlation between um, when we didn't use theory, how things didn't work, but when we used theory, although this was sort of unconscious, I mean, it wasn't like I knew it. It was like it's just so happened that, oh, we used theory there, and look, that worked out much better versus when we didn't. And it made me realize too a couple of things. One was that a theory-based foundation for learning and development design decisions is essential. So in the time since then, my work has been much better. But also I realized that a lot of this is really intuitive. And a lot of the decisions that we made that turned out to be theory based were really just common sense. Like, pay attention to the teacher, Joe, is the classic line my mother used to deliver as I walked out the door in the morning. And it's common sense, but it's also based on the theory. So that's what led me to this work here, and I'm really excited to share with you some of my observations about how you can learn about learning theory and how you can apply it in your program management and in your design decisions.
That's great, Joe. And I also wanted to point out that Joe has some courses on LinkedIn Learning, one of them being on this topic. And overall, your courses have been experienced by over 160,000 learners. So congratulations, that's very
Great.
impressive. So let's dive in with an initial question. I'm wondering, why is learning theory always thought of uh, in a way that is disconnected and theoretical, as opposed to something that's just a practical approach to learning design?
Yeah. Well, if you think about, you can see the photos here. If you think about learning theory in the same way that an architect needs to think about just the fundamental laws of physics, that you have to you could design a really beautiful structure, but if it's
Mhm.
not, accounting for, how load-bearing walls work, or stress distribution in the foundation, et cetera, the building's going to collapse at some point. Whereas if you pay attention to those things, you'll build a solid structure that will last. So without theory, if we now take that metaphor and apply it to learning and development, without theory, very often, and this is what I was doing before I went back to school, you're prone to guess, to follow gimmicks, and you're basically hoping that learning will happen. You're not really sure whether it will or it won't. But with theory, you're making very informed decisions based on how people actually learn. So basically, the key benefit of following learning theory is that what you're able to design experiences that work with the brain, not against it. And this is where it becomes intuitive and natural, because we know how we learn, we know how our brains work. And all we're really talking about doing here is not some abstract concept. It's about just following the natural organic ways that we learn, but doing it in a way that addresses specific learning challenges that we have. So we're using the right theoretical tool, if you will, to the need or the training requirement.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned, using, I think you mentioned using bells and whistles and a lot of bling with learning, because it doesn't always get the end result that we're looking for. So I know there's probably a lot of people attending today who understand these concepts, but a lot of people we found in learning and development sort of came up through the ranks through sales or engineering, and find themselves in roles where they aren't as learned in these particular theories. So this would be, hopefully, this will provide a good example for how they can describe this to their leadership, for example,
Absolutely.
and to their subject matter experts and stakeholders. Can you give us, examples of these learning theories so that we can understand each of them?
Absolutely. Let's take a look at what, we talked about the five ways, and we're going to talk about five essential learning theories. Now, there's many more learning theories out there than this. There's things like connectivism, et cetera. But these five here, behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, social learning, and adult learning, really give you enough of a basis in practice so that you can take the theory, figure out what your learning objectives are, and apply that theory to to the practice itself. So, and this is where, just to your point before, Brenda, this is where the whole reason why this course that we did, this LinkedIn Learning course, came up, was because many of their customers who are, L&D managers were saying, our L&D professionals, our instructional designers, our course developers, or even our learning technology folks don't know enough about these theories. And what we need to do is some training, is an educational learning experience around how these work. Because important point that you mentioned before, Brenda, it's really helpful to be able to explain to subject matter experts and stakeholders why you're making the design decisions that you're making, and that they have a basis in actual research and science. And so that's why, it's so important to do these. So let's just go through the five, starting with behavior. What behavior is about shaping observable skills through practice and feedback.
Mhm.
Cognitivism is about managing how the mind processes information. Constructivism is about building understanding and making meaning through experience. Social learning is about learning through observation and interaction. And finally, adult learning is about respecting experience and self-direction. Now, these are all individual theories that were developed at different times at different places by different psychologists and research scientists, but they aren't competing approaches, and they're complementary tools. And so while behavior helps us shape specific skills, cognitivism shows us how to manage information load. Constructivism guides discovery learning. Social learning leverages peer interaction, and adult learning theory ensures that we respect our learner's experience and autonomy. And you can see how these are all components of a learning experience. And so what you're going to find is that depending on what you're designing, what your objectives are, you might be borrowing and pulling and pushing and pulling from uh, these various theories. So the key is knowing when to apply which approach, and quite often we'll use several in conjunction, in combination.
So how do you know, how do you make that decision of what to apply and in what circumstance? That sounds like it would require like an analysis of not just the content, but also the learners. And sometimes you have learners at different levels. I'm just curious what
Absolutely.
that analysis looks like.
So yeah, I'd love to get into that. I want to ask everyone out there though, are there any would you like some more detail on each of these learning theories, and are any of these learning theories new to you, and you feel like you'd like me to cover in more detail what they all are, because that's kind of the key to Brenda's question.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
I think
yes,
you could see
please.
we're getting some
Okay.
yeses.
Okay, so
And
great.
I know at some point we'll answer
I'm
the
going to
industry
refer I'm going
question
to refer
there.
back to my own notes here from my course, and I would encourage you to take notes on this, because the more you take a pen out and write your notes, the better you'll remember this. So let's talk about behaviorism first of all. So behaviorism focuses on observable behavior changes through stimulus response patterns. And so applications for this in our world are role play training with immediate feedback, for example, gamified learning with rewards done correctly,
Mhm.
step-by-step skill building with clear performance criteria, and safety training, for example, with demonstrable compliance behaviors. So this is like when you think about, if you see something, speak up. So there's a stimulus. If you see something, speak up. That's the
Mhm.
response. What you want when you have training where that's the goal, you're going to want to use behaviors principles, because you want clear behavioral expectations with measurable outcomes. So that's
Right.
behaviorism. Cognitivism centers on how the mind receives, processes, stores, retrieves information. It's like the foundation of memory, of how
Mhm.
memories are formed and recalled. So
Like
we
the physiology of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
memory is so important in learning, and so understanding cognitive principles. So this comes in handy when learners need to master organized knowledge, like employee handbooks or complex procedures,
Mhm.
technical systems, that kind of thing. And you can, in doing so, you can apply cognitive load theory, which will help you understand how to chunk information into smaller pieces, use memory aids, create mental models, build from simple to complex structures. So you see, these are the theoretical principles that you can then apply to that kind of training objective that will allow you to do it. So this is
Does,
essential for managing how much information learners can handle over what period of time.
so I would imagine there's a lot of repetition, but timed properly with a cognitism approach.
Absolutely.
It,
One of the keys to cognitivism is to get past the problem we often have of too much content in too short a time, and only presenting it one time, versus spaced repetition, which is repeating the content in smaller chunks over a longer period of times, much more likely. This is called, based on the thing, something called the forgetting curve, much more likely that it will stick and people will be able to recall what you've taught them in the moment of need. So moving on, constructivism. This was the one that I knew absolutely nothing about until I went to graduate school, and turned out to be something I got really, really excited about. because it addresses how learners actively build their own understanding, their own meaning, their own through problem solving activities and experiential learning. So while cognitivism is kind of installing a mental model that you'll then follow, constructivism is you're building your own model that
Yeah.
works best for you based on your experience of the learning and based on your prior knowledge. So this is perfect for developing critical thinking, innovation, problem solving skills. And in doing so, what you do is you design to create authentic challenges, you encourage experimentation in the learning process, build in reflection time. It's a simple technique, but building in reflection time where you're asking learners to think about what they've learned and how they've learned it is a very powerful technique.
Can
And
I,
connecting new knowledge to existing experience.
yeah, I just want to ask about that because it sounds very solitary because it's all based on the individual and their experience. So it's going to be between people, it's going to be different, right? So is that something that is more effective in a asynchronous e-learning type scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question, and in fact, there's something called social constructivism, in which you're building your own mental models, but you're doing so as part of a community. So this is where, say, for example, social learning and constructivism comes together. Uh,
Okay.
but you're right. There's in an asynchronous e-learning environment, you're not connected with anyone, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. You're building your own meaning. But a good learning program would also include some way for you to take what you've experienced and what you've built out into a public forum with your peers, with your managers, to start to share what you've learned and hear back from others about what they've learned. So it's an important concept of combining the two so that you have something called social constructivism. Um, so speaking of social learning, we all know and we've all experienced how we learn through observation of others, watching other people do things, having them modeling, interacting with others, as I was just explaining. And these can be leveraged through, mentoring programs, communities of practice, peer coaching, collaborative problem solving, and, essential for developing soft skills, cultural knowledge, complex capabilities that benefit from observing expert performance and the way groups and teams interact. So that's
Is
social.
there, yeah, I had a question about that. Are there, and maybe we can say this till later, but are there things to avoid when it comes to social learning? Because putting people into an environment, there's all these social dynamics. I would think it has to be handled very carefully with some rules and guidelines and a lot of courage sometimes in a
Yeah,
social.
it's a great question, and it's at the heart of effective social learning. So there's two principles to think about. The one uh, is called positive social pressure. So the element that gets social learning really working for you is when people feel what we call positive social pressure. So you have that feeling like I'm in a group, I need to contribute to the group, I have a responsibility, within the group to participate, and there's a little bit of pressure on me, but it's
Yeah.
positive. And that leads to the second thing. It's only positive if you create psychological safety in the group, which establishes trust, which establishes feelings of being able to, willing to make mistakes, accepting failure as something not to be avoided, but to be celebrated because it's a pathway to learning. So when you have psychological safety, then you can enact positive social pressure and you have all the benefits of social learning mitigating the potential downsides of what can happen when people interact in negative ways.
So I'm just thinking before the social learning, uh, whatever it might be, community practice begins, there's actually a training on how to behave in these situations?
Well, sure.
Often, is that something?
Yeah, I mean, let's suppose you're going to have a workshop where there's going to be a lot of of this type of interaction where positive social pressure is going to be a factor, you might design into the program, trust building exercises at the
Got
outset
it.
to help establish that. There's again, when you start to use the theories as your guiding point, your design and development decisions
Mhm.
become much more to the point of how the learning will work best because you're guided by these things. So for example, oh, we're going to have social interaction. We need positive social pressure, which means we need to develop trust. So let's build some trust building into
Ah, I
the
see.
program. I'm just reading some of the concept here. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, as Robert here says, the nature of the subject and the learning objective would drive which learning domain and related theories should be trusted. So that's what I'll cover next, actually, um,
Okay.
uh, which gets back to your original question, which led me to this. How do you equate the two? Because that's what this is all about. So if we go
Is
to
there a, did we talk about adult learning before we go on to the
Oh
next?
yeah, sorry,
Sorry,
you're
right.
right.
That's okay.
The important one to skip. So adult learning, also known as andragogy, or I think I always it's a tongue twister for me, which is the like pedagogy, which is the how children learn. So several years ago, a theorist by the name of Malcolm Knowles discovered androgyny, which really talks about how adult learning is a different kind of activity, because adults bring experience to the learning process. They seek relevance. They prefer self-direction. They want
Mhm.
autonomy. And so the design decisions that you're going to make are going to be ones that honor prior knowledge, make learning immediately applicable, um,
Mhm.
provide choice in learning paths, so a lot of autonomy around that. Personalized learning paths is something that's important. Connecting things to real workplace challenges, so you're not wasting people's time. And again, it's respecting autonomy. So this is critical for all workplace learning because when we're dealing with adults in the workplace, regardless of
Yeah.
what their roles are, but especially leadership development and professional skills, where
Ah,
comes to the fore. So that's and adult learning is something that is part of every one of these. If you're
right.
deploying behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, social learning, you're always thinking about I'm training or I'm teaching adults. What do I have to keep in mind as I enact these other theories? Okay, so let's go on to the next slide where here's a little bit of I'm going to start to answer your question, Brenda, about how do you know what to use when. So on this slide, I'm going to talk about theory-based design remedies. So when we make a poor design choice, or let's call it an uninformed design choice, we might get something like, for example, and that's not all those on the left-hand side, where we start to equate knowledge with behavior. If we just give them the facts, they'll know what to do with them. When that is
Mhm.
is true, behavior is different from knowing about something is different than knowing how to do something. And knowing about, you can use cognitivism or constructivism to help people create a mental model of the knowledge base, but you need behaviorism, observable steps with feedback so that people learn how to do something and they do the behavior. So not equate so equating knowledge with behavior can get you into trouble. An informed choice would be to leverage behaviorism. Information overload. We all know this one, right? Like too much content. And here's where if you give too much content over too short a period of time, it's a drinking the fire hose scenario, a conundrum, and people are not going to remember what you've taught them, and it's a complete waste of time. And this is where you have to apply cognitive load theory, where you're learning things. We talked about it before, chunking things down, spaced repetition, etc. You might run into very passive instruction where, let's say in a workshop, you're just giving people a lecture and you're
Mhm.
not giving them any chance to um, practice what they've learned, to experience it, to see how it applies to what they already know, to see how they might use it in the future in situations that they're imagining. So this is where constructivism comes into play. Um, we might have, as we talked about before, isolated learning or lonely learning, where the person is learning on their own. This is the problem of asynchronous learning. I've clicked through these screens. I took a test at the end, and I'm done. And I haven't had a chance to share what I've learned with anyone else. That's always a danger because by sharing it with others, comparing notes, telling other people what you've learned, asking them what they've learned about the same topic, discussing
Mhm.
it with your manager about how you're going to apply what you've learned. In other words, incorporating social learning, you're much more likely to have the learning stick and the learning become valuable to the learner. And then finally, one size fits all, where you have learning that doesn't account for the individual adult's learning preferences, prior knowledge, how they're going to apply it to their particular case, and very often that learning doesn't stick. So these are some common design choices, choices that we make or that we're forced to make. And very often, this is an important point. Very often, we're forced to make these design
Yeah.
decisions because the stakeholders and the SMEs kind of insist on it. And this is where learning the theory can really help you because, and you don't want to become a lecturer of learning theory to these folks because their eyes are going to
Right.
get over. But you
As soon
do,
as you mentioned the word theory,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. But you do want to learn to talk about how what you want to design will help meet their objectives in getting learners who are, attain proficiency or mastery or learn how to do something. This is very helpful in helping you dissuade them from poor design choices and giving you some leverage about helping them choose, work with you to choose things that actually work.
So before we leave, there's a couple of questions coming in, and I just want to get them on the table for you here. First of all, the one size fits all, and this concept that, you know, younger people are, having more knowledge. They're coming to the table with more knowledge earlier in life. So when we look at having, what is it, 4 generations uh, of experience, but knowledge accelerating, with young, with the, everything that everybody learns so quickly in life these days. Um, how is that addressed when I mean, when it's intergenerational, you have people at different skill levels?
Yeah, well, I would agree with that comment in that I think our education system is needing to respond to um, teenage learners, let's say, or even college student learners who should be addressed more like adults than in the tenets of adult learning theory, autonomy and
Mhm.
mapping to prior experience, et cetera, comes into play. And I can tell you from my own experience, several years ago, I was teaching high school in China, and my job there was to prepare high school students not only to learn better English, but to prepare themselves for going to university in the US or the UK or Canada or Australia, where the learning system was quite different. And so we had to do, much different. We had to sort of revolutionize the high school teaching approach to something that would benefit them more in terms of an eventual acculturation to American universities. And what this required was introducing adult learning theory
Ah,
into the environment because that's what it required for them to do that. So I completely agree with that concept. It's not adult learning is not just for adults. It's for soon to be adults.
and here's one also from Robert. Thank you for that, Joe. But I don't want to skip over this one because I think it's an interesting question, as to how would you apply a positive pressure in an asynchronous or independent uh, offering. Is there a way to do that, or would that be like that comes after or before?
Yeah,
Um,
this is Gabriella's question.
Excuse me. Oh, sorry, Gabrielle. Yeah.
This is kind of a multi-generational question.
Oh, okay. I know there was one
Oh,
prior to that. Is how you add social learning to asynchronous. or is it just not within
Oh,
that
okay,
umbrella?
great. That's a great question.
Yeah, and then we'll get to Gabriella. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had some experience of this dealing with compliance training at T-Mobile, where people were basically in asynchronous learning environments. They were watching the compliance training, which was based on storytelling techniques, watching videos, and but they would watch it on their own. And what we started to build into the process were two things. One was we gave to the managers of these people manager discussion guides that enabled the managers to speak to their entire teams after everyone had watched their own, had watched the videos themselves and have a discussion about it. So we gave the managers tools to have a post-training conversation about it. And that can be done with almost any training that you're doing. And it's a great technique. You give the manager tools to facilitate discussion post the training experience in a social setting. Another thing that we did experiment with was that we created watch parties. This is a familiar concept to most people. We created watch parties where learners would sit down together in a conference room and go through the training together and comment along the way. We would give them special watch party techniques
Oh, that's great.
do it. So there's ways to bridge the gaps between these things. If we just, again, think about the theoretical, how do people really learn? And are
Yes.
we building that kind of thing into it? Are there things about what we're asking them, the way that we're teaching people that are going to be a problem? Are there theoretical principles that can help solve it? And that's where these ideas came from, is by applying theory. And I want to
Interesting.
address Gabriella's question there, because
Yes, please. Very
that's
interesting
a
question here.
multi-generational question. The first thing that comes to mind there is that I would pair the newer workforce person and the more experienced workforce person in pairs and do paired discussions in which they teach each other and they explore together how they are learning the materials. And so this would be a constructivist approach with the social learning component, where
Ah,
by getting to experience the other person's experience through dialogue and comparison, it's not only enhancing their own learning by seeing the comparison, it's helping them understand each other, which would then, as the learning experience event goes on, they're more capable of supporting each other in a common cause, which is everyone needs to learn these same objectives.
well, I think it's interesting that there's a thought here that the older learner is going to learn more slowly, or that the younger learners are learning more quickly. Is it something that's commonly true, or does it depend on the topic?
Well, I think it depends. I think that, for example, if let's say it's technology,
Yeah.
I think you could safely predict that a younger person who grew up, with a computer in their hand before age 5,
Hmm.
to someone like me, is going to be much more facile in adapting and learning new technologies. Yeah, I mean, it's not 100%, but they're more technology savvy than the older generations. On the other hand, if you're dealing with a situation, let's say in a skills area, like a leadership training program, the older person's experience might allow them to conceptualize things based on prior experience that the younger person would not really have a touch point with. And so in that case, the older worker might have an easier time, learning something than the younger person would. So again, it all depends.
Yeah, and it's somewhat related to the next slide that you've got here with AI and VR and other emerging technologies coming about that are really transforming learning and development. How do these foundational theories help to make better decisions, I guess, specifically around using these tools? I mean, because clarity, we're obviously talking to many clients every week that are still trying to figure out, how, can we use VR for this, for example? And we have to explain the complexities of that. And obviously, we're trying to identify the talent that can walk them through an exploratory process about what really makes sense um, for whatever learning goal they have. But we have had a lot of experiences where people want to do VR or use other technologies, and the consultants that we engage with that client are basically saying, you don't really need anything that technologically advanced to achieve your goal. So how do you make those decisions, and actually, how do you talk people out of that? Because sometimes they get it in their mind that they really have to use a certain tool when maybe it's not necessary.
Okay, great question. I want to answer that question in like two steps. And to get the all you learners out there a chance to think about Brenda's question as we talk through three different examples of um, specific examples of overcoming a poorly informed design decision into something that would actually work, and to see how technology, would or wouldn't help with that. So if we just go to the next slide, I have three more specific examples of how you're applying theory. So in the first column on this table, we have what's the learning need, then what's the problem created by a poor design choice or a poor use of technology? What's the theory that can then be applied? How would we apply that in practice? And here's where I want to encourage you to think about technology, because we're going to get to that in more detail on the next slide, and then what the result was going to be. So here's an example. So the first one, we have customer service team. They need to learn how to support customers with a new product release. And this is again the problem of too much cognitivism, in which we taught them they know what they know the facts, they know what to do, but they don't know how to do it. So there's that problem. So we apply behaviorism and social learning. We break the behaviors into observable action. We create practice sessions with immediate feedback. We add peer observations and modeling. So think for a second. All right, this is and we'll get this in detail. But think for a second: is what technologies might you apply? New technology might you apply
Mhm.
to make this practice come alive? The result of what you do would be increased employee confidence and motivation, and improved
Mhm.
customer satisfaction scores. Next example. Everyone's been through this. There's new software to learn. How do I learn the new software? And what we're given is generic training, and this isn't working because the generic training is teaching me how to use the software in a way that is not how I'm going to use the software. So
Mhm.
we add adult learning and cognitivism to solve the problem. Conduct needs assessment to identify real use cases. We create bite-sized tutorials addressing actual pain points. We build on existing employee knowledge and workflows. How could technology support those learning design practices? Because what we want is increased adoption of the new software. We want accelerated proficiency among the workers, and we want to reduce the burden on the support tickets. Okay, final example, leadership skills development, completely a different kind of training. We're here where we developed lecture-based workshops in which it was, lecture only, in one ear, out the other. Everyone left without really knowing how to apply what was being spoken to them. So here's where we apply constructivism and social learning. And in doing so, we shift to real business scenario challenges. We create collaborative problem solving environments, and we build in reflection and peer learning opportunities. How might we use technology to support that, to get deeper knowledge and skill transfer and higher level strategic thinking capabilities? So here's just to summarize where we are: three very different training needs,
Yeah.
very different ways that we could not do a good job of giving people an effective learning experience, how we applied theory, and here's what we designed and developed. But if we think about it, again, to your question, Brenda, which we'll now move over towards, how would we use technology to support these
Mhm.
practices? And that's the kind of thing that the question we want to answer. So let's go to the next slide for a second. And I'm sure you guys have all come up with interesting ideas for ways to do it. Here's four technologies that we might consider, because the theory will inform, as you just saw on the prior slide, and as you just thought through on your own as I presented these, as you know, you have it in your notes, I'm sure, how these inform technology decisions. So, for example, with that first example of the customer service people who didn't know how to do something, well, perfect application of VR training, where we want to induce safe practice behavior. Where, in other words, we want a safe environment for the learner to practice the behaviors where, before they take it out into the real world. So before they're actually talking to real customers, they're talking to, virtual reality customers. So there's one example. Um, Social platforms, a lot of opportunities there, especially like in the leadership training, for example, where we want to promote networking and collaboration around the development of leadership skills and the application of those skills to actual leadership challenges that people in an organization are facing. So you use a social platform to build a community of practice about where learners as peers or the leaders as peers are are sharing their experience in applying what they've learned to their actual leadership challenges across the board. AI personalization, this is a really incredible one right now. If you really think about it, this is like, as you really think about it, it becomes astounding what
Mhm.
we are already becoming capable of and will increasingly be able. We all think about learning personalization. I want learning that's personal to me. So imagine an AI agent who kind of knows it's in their large language model, all the content that the SME gives you. So the AI agent knows everything that needs to be learned and knows what roles people, what different roles people have that need what they're learning. And so I'm a new learner. I just come on board and I need to learn this new thing, whatever. The AI examines me, interviews me, quizzes me about all kinds of things. What do I already know? What's my job? How do I think I'm going to need to, what do I need to learn? What do I, what's my learning preferences? I like to watch videos, or I like to, I like things repeated over time, whatever it is. And that AI agent then develops a completely custom learning experience for that learner based on the knowledge that's there. That's already starting to happen, and that's going to become commonplace. So, our job in the world that we live in is really learning how to develop those kinds of AI agent um, uh, environments that are going to be able to do that. So that's a great one for applying cognitive load and adult learning choice. And then finally, micro learning, which has been around for quite some time. I used to work for a company called it was called Q. What was it called? It was first called Spaced Ed, and then they changed it to QStream, where it was designed around using small chunks of repeated knowledge that was sent out to you over time after a training event that would allow you to, through spaced repetition, continue to learn things. So again, all of these are technologies that are useful and helpful, but not if we just throw them out there without thinking about how we're going to use theory to apply them in ways that support the way people actually learn. The poster
Yeah.
child for doing it the wrong way is gamification, which can, on the one hand, be very effective. On the other hand, can just be a big gimmick where the learning doesn't become education, it becomes entertainment as opposed to nothing, and no learning really happens, even though they had a good time during the event. So that's
So,
that's the story there.
yeah, I have a question because there's so much coaching going on now, not just for leaders, but for people at all levels, which seems to be like the antithesis of a technology uh, forward way of learning. That one-on-one ability to be able to talk about what your struggles are, set goals, work with somebody in like you said, psychological safety, with also expectations being set. Is there a certain kind of technology that's used in those situations, or is it just find the way it is, human to human interaction with the mentoring? There's a lot of we have a lot of requests for creating mentoring programs or having cohorts go through um, 6 months of coaching, for example, and then they all come together and there's a capstone, uh, that really tries to tie it all together and create a social learning aspect to that. But I'm just wondering if that has a technological bend
Well,
to it.
sure, absolutely, in a few different ways. So I think first of all, the the increase, the rise, if you will, as you just described it, of coaching as a, as a component of corporate learning and development, is really kind of evidence of the fact that people are understanding that social learning is such a powerful tool in developing people. And so, we want to do more coaching. We want to do more, peer coaching, if you will. We want those things. And and the good news is that at this time and place, those can be afforded. I mean, you have the old tried and true, two people sitting down in a room together, face to
Yeah,
face. There's no technology involved other than, with whatever paper and pencil they bring to take notes. Um, but you have social platforms that allow for development of communities of practice and, coaching that now can take place online, um, because it's so easy to use, and you can record things, and you can have, notes taken of what went on in the coaching. So there's a lot of ways that technologies today are making the coaching itself much more accessible, much more powerful, much more impactful than it ever has. And it overcomes, of course, barriers of time and space, where, now we can do things like we're doing here online,
right.
Teams and Zoom environments, where, whereas we couldn't before. So, again, all you're doing is taking the technologies that exist and saying, how do we use these technologies to apply the theories to get the learning outcomes that are so important to us.
That's, that's great. Thank you, Joe. There's a question here from Courtney and I just want to note that we are at about 48 minutes now. I know we'll be wrapping up pretty quickly here, but want to get to as many questions as possible. If you could just sort of take that in and respond to her
Yeah, I see Courtney's question.
or
So,
him. Sorry.
yeah, the question about gamification. Well, in the short answer to your question is, um, you know, uh, and the problem with gamification in general is when the reward system that you create as part of gamification becomes the driver, the motivator for participation in the learning experience. So, and it becomes so for, and whether it's points and badges or whether it's actual real things like, toaster ovens and money, if that becomes what people are there for, that eventually loses its moment, loses its steam, so to speak. And then you're left where nobody's learning anything because no one's showing up in order to learn anything. So it has to be, you have to really make sure that the focus around the game is around the motivation to learn more, and the game just becomes a mechanism for doing that, as opposed to a mechanism for um, uh, accumulating reward that has nothing to do with the learning itself. I'm sorry, that's not a very complete answer. It's a complicated
Yeah, I was going to say there's a
Question,
lot
question,
more with
question,
examples and
question,
everything.
but that's, in the amount of time I have, that's my brief,
Yeah,
but
no, that's great.
not
That's
so
great.
efficient.
Well, how do people get started?
Okay, so
If
let's go
they
to
if
the
they
next.
haven't been
Next,
applying this, what would be a good
yeah,
way?
and and this is a good way for Courtney to get into. Let's go to the next slide for you, Courtney. Next steps: do a theory audit. Pick one current learning program. So if you have a program in which you're using gamification, ask what type of learning is actually needed here. And here's an example below. Is it observable skills? Is it complex knowledge? Is it problem solving? Is it team capabilities? Is it learner motivation? Start with what learning is needed, and then figure out what theory, as I've described today, you can apply to design a learning experience that's going to address that type of learning, that's going to address that type of learning need, whether it's behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, social learning, adult learning, or a combination of all of the above. And then make one theory-based improvement to see whether you get a better result or not. So this is what, it's easy to do. You start with one small thing and you gradually build your muscle around really learning and understanding what the theories are, how to map them and match them and align them with a learning need, and then how to make design choices that are informed by the theory. So that's a good next step for anyone to take, because there's always a program that you can look at and say, this could be done better.
Very good. Great advice. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Joe.
And
Really want to, is there any final thoughts before we?
yeah, it's just the final thoughts, key takeaways. Remember that learning theory is really a practical toolkit, not an academic abstraction. And so the more you can make it into something that's practical and can be explained and applied in practical ways, the better off you are. Always match theory to learning need. This is part of the practicality of it. Different challenges require different approaches. So start to get good at matching the theory to a learning need. Start small. Apply one theoretical principle to improve one program at a time, and get better and better at it as you go along. And then finally, remember that when you understand how people learn, you can create learning experiences that actually work. Or the obverse is true. It's that you'll never create learning experiences that actually work unless you do understand how people learn. Because if you do, in that case, you were just lucky. So
Yeah,
it really
yeah.
is as simple as that. You really do need to understand how people really learn, which is what the theory tells us, to create learning theories that actually work, which is the practice part of it.
So on that note, are there any other writers that you would recommend
Yeah,
exploring or
we go to the
reading?
next slide, and at the risk of the one after that, and we can come back to any questions if we have time. Um, I think we missed a slide there around my course. Well, I guess I'll just, and I'll put it in the chat here. Hold on. If you want to get into more detail with all of this, I recommend my course. It was designed uh, to provide that, because in addition to my video, I'm going to put this, there it is. There's the link to it.
Thank
In
you,
addition
Joe.
to the videos where I explain all this in far more detail, there's also, along with the course, in the exercise files that we have, a whole learning primer, or primer, if you will. Learning Theory 101, that gives you a whole research thing. You can read that, and you've learned a lot of what it took me years and years to learn. And the other thing, because Brenda, you mentioned, who are people to study. I did something really interesting with AI as part of this project that I think you'll find interesting if you go there. But there's all the theorists behind this, B.F. Skinner and Malcolm Knowles and John Dewey and Ivan Pavlov. These are all the
Mhm.
theorists who, contribute to this body of knowledge that I've been able to use to, develop this course and make this presentation. So what I did was I said to myself, how would those people who are long gone respond theoretically to the learning challenges that we face today? So I loaded up all their content into an AI agent, and I created mock interviews where I interviewed each of these people to give me their answer to current learning problems. And the result was really amazing. They did a great job of answering my questions with their prior knowledge into new categories. So it's a great way if you want to learn what
Incredible.
these theorists are all about and what they did. Look at my imagined interviews with them,
Oh,
and
that's so cool, Joe.
yeah, so it's a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. And so what learning theories did you apply in creating this presentation today?
Uh, Well,
Fun question.
I think a little bit of
I was
everything,
gonna say.
as much as I could. For example, the constructivism, certainly, in getting and asking you to think about how you would, apply these things. Encourage you to ask questions, and answering your questions, a little bit of social learning there. Um, the advice to how to apply it would be an example of adult learning theory, where you have a chance to take this learning and apply it as you see fit. I guess we didn't do too much of behaviorism in this one, but other than to suggest a step-by-step process in actually carrying this out. So I always try to think of all of them when I can.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that overview, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Joe, we really appreciate it very much, and we appreciate your time. We know how valuable it is. Just a plug, we've got some upcoming webcasts that we're going to veer into some different areas with AI, maybe a focus on governance, ethics, change management, these kinds of areas, and then back into the technology aspect of that. So keep an eye on the Clarity website for that. Hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you
Thanks,
again.
everyone. Take good care.